This is Joseph's story, and it is one of betrayal, patience, and redemption. Born as the favored son of Jacob, Joseph was a dreamer, but his dreams stirred jealousy and hatred in his brothers. Betrayed, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned, Joseph's life seemed to spiral into a helpless void. Yet even in darkness, God was at work. Through Joseph's faithfulness and trust in God, he rose from prisoner to prince, becoming the second most powerful man in Egypt. In the end, the very brothers who betrayed him stood before him in need, and Joseph chose mercy over revenge, forgiveness over judgment. And in this ancient story, we glimpse something far greater. Joseph's life foreshadows another beloved son who was rejected by his own, unjustly condemned, and willingly died for others' salvation. Like Joseph saving his family, Jesus came to save the world and redeem all who choose to follow him. Joseph was born into a complicated family. His father, Jacob, loved Joseph more than his other sons, spurring bitter jealousy between the brothers. Joseph was the child of his old age, the son of Rachel, the wife Jacob loved most. His favoritism was woven into Joseph's life by even his very garments, as Jacob made for him a robe of many colors, a richly ornamented robe setting Joseph apart. Not only did favoritism breed resentment, as Joseph's brothers watched their father's affection rest heavily on this one son, but Joseph's youth meant he lacked wisdom. When God gave him dreams of his brother's sheaves bowing to his own, symbols of his brother's submission to him, Joseph rushed to share these visions. To his brothers, these dreams were not divine promises, they were insults, and with every telling, their hatred grew. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers as they tended flocks far from home. When they saw him approaching, the robe visible from a distance, something dark stirred in their hearts. "Here comes that dreamer," they said. At first, they conspired to kill him, but the eldest brother showed him mercy and intervened. Instead of murdering him, they stripped Joseph of his robe and threw him into a pit, cold, empty, silent. Later, as traders passed by, Joseph's brothers sold him for 20 pieces of silver. They watched as he was taken away, powerless as his cries faded into the distance. Then they stained the robe with blood and brought it back to their father, making Jacob believe Joseph was dead while Joseph was carried into Egypt alone. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Though Joseph was far from home and surrounded by a foreign culture, God did not abandon him. Everything Joseph touched prospered as God's blessings remained on him. Potiphar noticed and placed Joseph over his entire household. But Joseph's period of testing wasn't over. Potiphar's wife desired Joseph and pursued him relentlessly. Joseph refused, not only out of loyalty to his master, but out of reverence for God. Joseph stayed faithful even when no one was watching. Then one day, when the household servants were away, she grabbed hold of Joseph's cloak and attempted to seduce him. Joseph fled from the house, but in his haste, he left his cloak in her hands. Spurned, she accused him falsely, and Joseph was innocently thrown into prison. But even in the darkest of dungeons with no prospect of freedom, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord granted Joseph favor in the eyes of the warden, who put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners and everything that was done in the prison. Joseph knew this was a time of testing as he called the prison a pit, hearkening back to the literal pit his brothers threw him into in his homeland. Even in the darkest of situations, Joseph was elevated back into responsibility and approval. For his character remained consistent whether he was favored or forgotten, whether wearing a coat of many colors or prison rags. He served faithfully wherever God placed him, and God continued to bless him and those around him. Sometime later, 2 of Pharaoh's servants, a cupbearer and a baker, were imprisoned with him. Each had dark dreams, and Joseph noticed they were troubled by them. After hearing their dreams, Joseph interpreted them through God's insight. One dream foretold restoration, the other, judgment. Both came true. Everything happened exactly as Joseph had said would happen 3 days later. The cupbearer was restored to his position, and the baker was executed. But before the cupbearer was released, Joseph asked him to remember him, saying, "For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." But the cupbearer forgot all about Joseph. Then 2 years passed. Pharaoh himself began to dream, disturbing visions of abundance devoured by famine, of plenty swallowed by emptiness. Pharaoh sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, but none could interpret the dreams. Then the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about the Hebrew slave in prison who had accurately interpreted dreams 2 years earlier. Joseph was summoned, brought from the prison, cleaned, and stood before the most powerful man in the world. When Pharaoh asked if he could interpret dreams, Joseph replied, "I cannot, but God will give Pharaoh the answer." Joseph explained the dreams: 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of devastating famine. Then he advised Pharaoh to prepare by taking 1/5 of produce every year during the plentiful time, storing grain for the great famine. The proposal pleased Pharaoh as he recognized Joseph's wisdom came from beyond human insight, and he took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen, and in a single moment, Joseph was elevated from prisoner to governor, second only to Pharaoh himself. He was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, 13 years after being sold into slavery by his brothers. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph traveled throughout Egypt, organizing the collection and storage of grain. He stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea, until he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Preparation was complete. Then the famine came, not only to Egypt, but to all surrounding lands. People came from everywhere seeking food. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, with him, because he feared harm might come to him. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt and bowed down before him with their faces to the ground, Joseph recognized them immediately, but they did not recognize the man Joseph had become. The dream from his youth, his brother's sheaves bowing down, was being fulfilled before his eyes. Joseph had a choice before him. Revenge was at his fingertips. He held power over the men who had destroyed his youth. But Joseph decided to test their hearts as he treated them as strangers, accusing them of being spies. They protested their innocence, explaining they were 12 brothers, with the youngest still at home and one who was no more. Joseph insisted they bring their youngest brother to Egypt to prove their story. Yet when Joseph dismissed them, he sent them back to their father with grain and secretly the silver they had paid with. Jacob was distraught when he heard how his sons fared and refused to let Benjamin go. But as the famine continued and their supplies ran out, Jacob had no choice but to send Benjamin too. When the brothers returned to Egypt with Benjamin, Joseph could barely contain his emotions. He prepared a feast for them, but when he saw Benjamin, his full brother through his mother Rachel, Joseph hurried out to a private room and wept. Joseph devised one final test. He had his steward fill his brother's sacks with grain, but in Benjamin's sack, he placed his own silver cup. Shortly after he dismissed them, Joseph sent his steward to overtake them and accuse them of theft, claiming the one who stole it would remain with Joseph. The cup was found in Benjamin's sack. The brothers were horrified. When they appeared before Joseph and Benjamin returned the cup to him, Judah, the same brother who had suggested selling Joseph years before, stepped forward, explained their father's deep love for Benjamin, and offered himself in Benjamin's place. This was what Joseph needed to hear. His brothers had changed. They were no longer the callous men who had sold him into slavery. They were willing to trade places with Benjamin and spare their father pain. Joseph could no longer contain himself. "I am Joseph." Fear seized his brothers. But Joseph spoke words that echo through history. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Joseph understood that his suffering had meaning, that his journey from favored son to slave to prisoner to governor was ordained by God to save not only Egypt, but his own family, the family through whom God would fulfill his covenant promises. Then Joseph embraced his brother Benjamin and Benjamin wept upon his neck. Joseph forgave his brothers and told them to hurry and bring his father to him. When Joseph finally saw his father after more than 20 years of separation, he threw his arms around him and wept for a long time. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." What was broken was restored. Joseph's life points forward, beyond Egypt and Genesis, to Jesus Christ. Joseph was the beloved son. Jesus is the beloved Son of God. Joseph was rejected by his brothers. Jesus was rejected by his own people. Both Joseph and Jesus were betrayed for silver, and both of them were falsely accused and unjustly condemned. Joseph descended into a pit and prison, but Jesus descended into death itself. Joseph was raised up to save many lives from famine, but Jesus was raised from the dead to save humanity from sin and death. Yet the story does not end with simple justice. It illuminates something even greater. The cross, like Joseph's pit, looked like defeat, but what others meant for evil, God turned it into something good. For Jesus' resurrection revealed God's greatest plan. The story of Joseph reminds us that suffering is not the end of the story. God is always working, weaving together the threads of our suffering and joy, our failures and triumphs, even in silence, even in darkness, to bring redemption. And through Jesus Christ, that redemption is complete.